It's time for more chaos, but instead of blood, we are now looking to disease and filth, with the wholly disgusting forces of the Maggotkin of Nurgle taking up our next faction pack review. Now, Matt, who you will have seen on the channel in some of our battle reports, he plays Maggotkin, so if I get anything wrong or say anything stupid or, really uncompetitive or just rubbish, do rest assured he will probably chew me out for it, but I'm going to do my best. So let's dive into their rules and see just what kind of putrid mess they will be bringing to 4th edition. The idea of diseases, plagues, and contagions is still their main army focus and rule, although it has changed in a few significant ways. Now their main battle trait is Blessed by the Plague Father, which procs at the end of any turn and lets you pick one of 3 effects. You can infect to give an enemy unit in combat with a Maggotkin unit the diseased keyword. You can spread, in which case you pick a diseased enemy unit and the diseased keyword spreads to each other enemy unit within combat range of them. Or you can pick mutate, and this can only be done if all enemy units have the diseased keyword, but if you do that, all of those units then take 1 mortal damage. So this is really all about moving up, getting into combat, and then spreading that diseased keyword around the enemy as much as possible. It then gets followed up by the Racked with Disease rule, which is again at the end of any turn and means you can roll a d3 for each diseased enemy unit, and on a 2+, you do that much mortal damage. So even if not all enemy units are diseased, they will still be taking 2 or 3 mortal damage at the end of every turn if they've got that diseased keyword. So it is still a very nice, consistent chip damage style ability that will be a real pain to armies that, rely on a good armor save because it will just get through that completely, and also armies that are really vulnerable to ongoing, consistent chip damage. The final part of their battle trait is just a bit of clarification, really. Desperate Remedies means that you can basically prevent enemy units from healing or returning models, to a degree anyway. If a diseased unit uses an ability to heal or return models, like Rally or Deathly Invocation, for instance, instead, that ability just removes the diseased keyword. So you will then need to go and reapply it in a subsequent turn, but it's a really strong ability for denying armies that rely on that recursion and that healing. Factions like the Soul Blight and the Flesh Eater Courts, and speaking as someone that plays both of those, I know this is going to hurt me a lot. They will genuinely hate this part of the rule for how much it is going to impact their ability to get models back, rather than just be removing the diseased keyword turn after turn after turn. The 4 battle formations the Maggotkin get follow a few of the old Plague Legion choices from 3rd edition, again to a bit of a degree. The Taliban of Nurgle brings you the passive Disease and Pestilence personified, which means from the 2nd battle round onwards, you can add 1 to the damage inflicted with the Racked with Disease rule. So now you can be doing between 3 and 4 mortal damage each turn to potentially the entire enemy army, which is really powerful when it's all up and running. The Tenders of the Garden Grotesque is a passive for the Nurgle's Menagerie formation. This allows you simply to set up 2 Feculent Gnarl Mauls in your army instead of just 1. They are quite useful, as we will see, for spreading the diseased keyword around a bit more, but I think this one is just okay. It's not the most exciting formation, in my opinion. The Vectors of Contagion rule comes along with the Plague Cyst formation. This means that when a Rotbringers unit, which is your mortal units generally, when one of them is slain by a combat attack, you can roll a number of dice equal to that model's health characteristic, up to a maximum of 4, and then you do a mortal damage on each 5+. So this is actually quite a solid little way for reflecting some damage back onto the enemy when they kill you, and you can genuinely do a good bit of work from each model. You can make it really difficult for melee focused armies to engage you very well at all, because as soon as they start killing off your guys, you will be killing them back in return. The final one is a movement-focused formation. The Affliction Cyst brings you From Noxious Skies, and this lets you, in the deployment phase, pick 2 Maggotkin units that have fly, and then they can be redeployed 9 inches away from enemies. So this gets you way up close and personal with your opponent, ready to move and potentially charge if you get the turn, or just block enemy movement for a turn, or just to move some units to put a load of pressure onto a specific flank. So this is really good, and I think is going to help a slow moving army like the Maggotkin really make the most of the board as much as possible. So I would say they're all fairly good. I love the Taliban, the Plague Cyst, and the Affliction Cyst the most. The extra Narmal is cute and could be useful, I think, but I would say it's definitely the weakest out of the four. As always, we get the 3 heroic traits and the 3 artifacts. The traits are Gift of Febrile Frenzy, giving you 1 inch extra of your movement to friendly Maggotkin units that don't have fly and are wholly within 12 inches of the bearer at the start of the move. So they can actually move to get out of wholly within if they do move that far. And an extra 1 inch of movement is in some cases for your army an extra 25% more movement for your guys. So this can be a really impactful one for your somewhat slow army. Grandfather's Blessing gives you the hugely powerful D6 heal at the end of any turn if the bearer is in combat with a diseased unit. So on some of your tankier heroes, this can make them nigh on impossible to put down, as they will just heal up at the end of any turn, so both yours and your opponent's, and they're already fairly tough to actually put damage on anyway, so they can just keep healing back up to their full health every single turn, and making it, as I said, almost impossible for your opponent to deal with them. Finally, the Overpowering Stench is a reaction and is used when an enemy is in combat with the bearer and uses a command. You can roll a dice, and on a 5+, the command has no effect, but this command point is still spent. Now, of course, the 5-up isn't that reliable, but as we've seen in previous reviews and talk about 4th edition, stopping command points and impacting that command point economy of your opponent can be absolutely huge in terms of winning the game. So I do think this could still be a very useful trait if you know you're going up against an opponent that is going to be spending a lot of command points and utilizing a lot of commands throughout the game, and you know you have a hero to put this on that they can get into combat reliably with your opponent's main important command point focused unit. In terms of artifacts, we see the return of Rustfang and the Witherstave, and we also get a new one, the Carrion Dirge. The Witherstave is in any combat phase, you pick an enemy unit that charge that turn that your hero is in combat with, and you roll a dice, and on a 4+, they get Strike Last. Now, this is a powerful effect, inflicting Strike Last. On a 4+, it is of course risky. You are, risking 50-50 odds essentially, but it could be worth it if you are willing to accept it won't always go off. The buff, or the debuff should I say, is strong enough, I think, that it can absolutely swing a combat in your favor when it does. So if you want to weigh up that risk and know that you aren't always going to benefit from it, I think it is worth taking potentially. The Rustfang is once per battle, and again in the combat phase, this allows you to pick an enemy unit in combat with your hero, and they get -1 to their saves for the rest of the battle. Now, despite this only being once per battle, this is super good because the effect does actually last the whole battle, and dropping a key hero or the enemy general from a 3-up save to a 4-up, or from a 4-up to a 5-up, does make them massively more vulnerable, and even if they then subsequently kill your hero, they are still going to be debuffed for the rest of the game, which means you can much more easily get revenge and kill them with your other units later on. Finally, we have the Carrion Dirge. This is again once per battle, but in your hero phase, and it allows you to pick 3 enemy units within 12 inches of your hero, and they all get -3 to their control score for the turn. So again, you can massively debuff a few enemy units and flip 1 or maybe even 2 objectives from your opponent's control into yours. So again, this is potentially a game-winning move. Taking control of objectives is obviously how you win the game, and if you do this in the late game towards the end of the game, it could just nab you those key objectives from under your opponent's nose that you need just to get those points to win you the game. So I really like this artifact as well. I think in general, all 3 have a lot of use. Despite 2 of them being once per battle abilities, I would say actually those 2 are probably the best out of the bunch. You also get a fairly solid spell lore with 3 spells all cast on a very appropriate 7+. Fleshy Abundance is your unlimited spell and lets you pick a Maggotkin unit wholly within 12 inches of your caster, and you can heal them D3 if they've taken any damage, or if they haven't, they get -1 to be wounded until your next turn. So it is a great little bit of extra healing, but also a really strong defensive boost for your already resilient units. Cloying Quagmire is put on an enemy unit within 18 inches and halves their movement, and if their save is 3 up or better, they also get -1 to their run and charge rolls until your next turn, so turning even speedy armies like Nighthaunt into essentially zombies, and making it harder for those scary melee units like Chaos Warriors or Chaos Knights or whatever get up and into combat with that charge roll debuff as well. Magnificent Buboes is your last spell and is now actually only 18 inches rather than 21 inches like it was in 3rd edition, but it still is the same in that it lets you pick an enemy hero and you can subtract 1 from their hit roll and their casting, chanting, banishment and unbinding rolls until your next turn, so you can make an enemy hero much less scary in combat, or you can make it much harder for an enemy wizard to get those spells off or attempt to unbind yours. So it's a very simple spell, but it is a very, very powerful one too. So they are all very good, and I can see, assuming you've got enough casters, you wanting to get all 3 of these off pretty much every turn to get you some extra healing or defensive bonuses, to get some good debuffing on enemy units, and also some really good debuffing on those enemy heroes as well. In terms of the actual War Scrolls, the army is a little bit smaller than some of the others we've covered, but we will start out with the demons, and first up is the big named Great Unclean One himself, Rotigus. He is a whopping 500 points, so he's gone up 100 points from 3rd edition, but he is still ridiculously resilient with 22 health and a 4-up save and a 5-up ward save to keep him company. He is still a 2-cast wizard as well, which is fantastic with your strong spell lore, and he can still throw out a really good amount of damage with his Gnarl Rod getting 5 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 2s with 1 rend and a flat 3 damage, and then his Maw also has a further 2 attacks at 2 rend and 2 damage. He's also then got a smattering of Nurgling attacks. They won't do much, but an extra 10 auto wounding attacks is never a bad thing to have just for clearing through some chaff. He does have his own spell, Deluge of Nurgle, which is cast on an 8, so potentially a bit trickier to get off, but this lets you pick each diseased enemy unit on the battlefield and each Nurgle unit in combat with a diseased unit, and you roll a d3, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage or that much healing to the enemy or your Maggotkin units. So this is a huge board-wide damaging or healing spell. So by the end game, this could easily be looking at doing a solid 8 or 9 damage or 8 or 9 healing across the entire army, across the entire board. He does also get +1 to his casting rolls with Bringer of Plenty, so that 8+ is a little easier to make, but it's still, as I said, not the easiest spell in the world to get off. His final ability is Mountain of Loathsome Flesh, and this is his Rampage. You get to do this in any charge phase after the unit has charged, and on a 3+, you can pick an enemy unit in combat with him, and you roll a number of dice equal to the models in the unit, and on a 5+, you do a mortal damage to them. So this is, again, like we've seen in all the other armies, a great way to clear out those bigger hordes of infantry, and wiping out 5 or 6 zombies as you crash into a unit of 20 of them before combat even begins will definitely help you get through them that much more quickly. The generic Great Unclean One is up next. He's a bit cheaper at 480 points, but he does lose 2 wounds, only being 20. He is still a solid 2-cast wizard though, and he gets a 4 damage weapon with his Blight weapons. They are 4 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 2s, and they are very nice on top of his Nurgling attacks as well for clearing through chaff. He also gets a short range but reasonably solid shooting attack. It's only 7 inches, but it's D3 plus 3 shots. They hit on 3s, wound on 2s with 2 rend and 2 damage, so it's not actually a bad profile, and it can be shot in combat too, so he can actually do quite a bit of work killing nearly 6 4-up save infantry before he even charges in, or when he's in combat and wants to shoot at them, is not terrible. He has the Plague Wind spell, which just grants an enemy unit within 12 inches the diseased keyword on a 7+, so it's nothing super spectacular, but as we've seen, spreading the diseased rule is a big part of this faction, and this definitely will help get that diseased keyword around the enemy army that little bit better, so it is a useful spell to have in your back pocket. He is also a Locus of Nurgle, and what that means is that once per turn in your movement phase, he can pick a friendly Maggotkin demon unit that had 3 or more models and has been destroyed, and you can roll a dice, and on a 4+, you can put a replacement unit wholly within 12 inches of your Great Unclean One and 9 inches from enemies. So he's actually also a really solid way to get a few units back over the course of the game, and you can reliably, I would say, get 1 or 2 units back across the entire game's length, and bringing back some Plague Bearers, for instance, could be quite a nasty little roadblock to put in front of your opponent. If you bring back, say, 10 Plague Bearers from a squad of 20, then immediately that has essentially knocked 140 points off the Great Unclean One's own cost, so it can make him quite a points efficient unit as well. His last ability is once per turn at the end of any turn, he has his Bloated with Corruption Rampage. This is done if your Great Unclean One is damaged, and he can pick 3 enemy units in combat with him, and you roll a d3, and on a 2+, they take that much mortal damage as the filth and pestilence spew out of his open wounds. It's nothing super amazing, but it is a nice reliable way to add yet more chip damage to take down a few enemy units that may be trying to surround him and take him down with weight of numbers. Following on from the big boys is the smaller Poxbringer, the Herald of Nurgle. He is a much cheaper 130 points, but he is still somewhat durable with 5 health and a 5-up ward. He does only have the 5-up save, but still that ward will come in clutch a lot for keeping him alive. He's also got some okay melee. It's only 3 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, so it's nothing super scary. It does have the crit mortal ability, so that can hopefully proc a few armor ignoring attacks as well, but he's not the best melee character out there. What he does have is the Captain of the Plague Legions rule, and what this does, it allows you to do that again, that nice combo of fighting with your hero and then getting a bigger squad to fight after him. So after this guy has fought, you can do this ability, which is a reaction, and pick a unit of Plague Bearers to fight immediately after him, and when they do, they get +1 to their hit rolls as well. He's also a 1-cast wizard, which is nice, and it means all told he is a semi-durable caster that is acceptable at melee, mainly because with a unit of Plague Bearers, he is going to get their attacks as well straight after his, so they can do a decent little bit of work into squishier enemies, if nothing else, and he is a decently viable pick, I would say, for his relatively cheap 130 points. Horticulus Slimux, I think I've said his name right, he is next. He is a very bizarre but interesting snail riding fella, and he brings a very snail-like 4-inch move, but with 8 health, a 4-up save and a 5-up ward, he is quite durable. He's got 3 attacks with his shears, which hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend, and then the snail also has some jaws, which hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and d3 damage, so he can do a little bit of work in combat. His main abilities though are cultivating the Garden of Nurgle, which means in your movement phase he can summon a new feculent Gnarlmaul within 12 inches of him and 3 inches away from enemies and objectives, as long as there is less than 3 of them on the table. And then the Beast Handler is once per turn in your movement phase. It lets you on a 3+ set up a replacement unit of Beasts of Nurgle within 12 inches of him and 9 inches from enemies. Now Slimux is 150 points and a Beast of Nurgle is 150 points. So if you manage to do this once in your game, he's basically made his points back. So I think he's actually quite good, especially if you are bringing a couple of Beasts of Nurgle along in your army anyway. He is just a great addition to quite reliably get 1, probably 2 of them back over the course of the game, which will basically net you 150 points in terms of the overall value of what he brings. The Spoilpox Scrivener is up next. He's a relatively cheap 100-point unit. Again, he's got about 5 health, 5 up save, 5 up ward, and moves 4 inches, which we will see on a lot of the demon units in the army. He's again got some mediocre melee with 4s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage thanks to his 3 distended maw attacks, but then he can also sneeze, which is quite hilarious actually. His sneezes are so bad that they do damage. They only do 1 damage, but it's d6 shots, so it's a big sneeze, and he could potentially kill off an enemy model or 2 with it, which is just, if nothing else, quite funny. His main ability is Keep Counting, I'm Watching You, which is once per turn in your hero phase, he can pick a Plague Bearer's unit wholly within 12 inches, and you can roll a d6, and then on a 2+, you can either give them +1 to their melee attacks, or you can give them +1 to their saves, thanks to recorded stamina. So just adding that little bit more damage output or durability to an already reasonably tanky little unit. They do only have 1 attack base, so this ability alone could potentially double their output. So it can make them, whilst they're not killy at the best of times anyway, it could make them substantially better than your opponent may be expecting. Keeping up with the hilarious names is the Sloppity Bilepiper. He's the same 5s to health, save and ward and 4-inch move, and the same 4s, 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage in melee, but his ability is the Jolly Gut Pipes. This lets you once per turn in any combat phase pick a Maggotkin demon unit wholly within 12, so it's not just Plague Bearers, it's any Maggotkin demon unit, and again you roll a dice, and again on a 2+, you get to pick an effect. You can choose a Stabbing We Will Go, which gives the unit +1 to wound rolls. You can go for Early One Evening My Pustule Was Seeping, which means ward saves can't be made against the target unit's combat attacks, or you can go My Love Is Like a Ripe Fart. And what that means is enemy attacks to your target unit are at -1 to hit. So you can get some really solid buffs from this guy, and he could in theory combo supremely well with the Scrivener to make something like a Plague Bearer unit +1 attack and ignoring ward saves, or -1 to be hit and +1 to their armor saves. So there are some potentially quite potent buff stacks you can do with these two, and for just 110 points for this guy, he is another nice cheap way to bring some solid bonuses to a couple of units in your army. The diminutive Nurglings are also here. They are 110 points for 3 and should maybe be a bit cheaper. I think maybe 90 points for 3 is a bit of a fairer value, but each base has got 4 health with a 6 up save and a 5 up ward. So they're not great. They're 36 points for 4 health and a 5 up ward. So nothing amazing, but they can be useful. Their big issue is that they only have a control of 1, and they have 5 awful attacks that hit and wound on 5s with no rend. What they can be though is a little bit annoying. They heal 3 at the end of any turn with Endless Swarm, so if your opponent doesn't kill off a whole base, it can heal back up to full. So against weaker, chaff, harassment style enemy units, they can be quite fantastic at being an annoying, resilient, persistent screen or unit to tie up those weaker enemy units and keep them bogged down. And even something like 10 Blood Warriors, not the most amazing melee unit, but you know, they are Blades of Khorne. 10 Blood Warriors will do around 6 damage to a unit of Nurglings, so they will kill 1 base but leave another on 2 health, so it can then heal back up at the end of the turn. And what that means is that a reinforced unit of Nurglings could in theory keep those 10 Blood Warriors tied up all game long, quite reliably. The Beasts of Nurgle are up next, and they are as fun-loving as ever. They've got a much nicer 7-inch move compared to the rest of the army, and with 8 health and a 5 up save and a 5 up ward, they can also take a bit of a punch. They only hit on 4s, but they do have 5 attacks that wound on 3s and have 1 rend and d3 damage, so they can do a decent amount of work into weaker chaff units. And then they also keep their Attention Seekers rule, which lets them in any charge phase make a charge roll into the closest enemy unit and then do d3 mortal damage if they get within an inch. So basically charging in the enemy's turn without having to spend a command point to do it, which is really strong. They do have quite a big downside in that they are beasts, so their control is capped at 1, so it means you can't charge them into an enemy to try and flip an objective. and they are maybe a bit pricey at that 150 points, but I would say they are very good at, moving in and charging in the enemy turn to tie up an enemy unit and stop them getting where your opponent needs them. And if you are bringing some, as I said earlier, alongside Horticulus Slimux, they get even better because he can potentially bring them back. On the faster moving side of things, we have the Plague Drones. These guys are quite speedy with a solid 8-inch move to go alongside their 5 health, 5 up save, and 5 up ward. They do only have 1 damage on all their attacks, but with 2 attacks from their Plague Swords and 6 from their Fly's limbs, they can throw out quite a lot of dice, 8 in total. They do only hit on 4s and wound on 3s with no rend, so they're not the most amazing attacks, but getting 3 for 180 points does mean you can have a fast-moving, durable little anvil that can actually hit back with a decent number of dice in melee when they do need to, so they can do some damage against stuff with low armor saves. They also have the Ripe Pastures rule, which is a passive that basically allows them to charge even if they've retreated, so falling back and going into another unit that is more of a threat to tie them up instead of some chaff units or whatever is definitely an option for them. And I think whilst they aren't going to kill much, with their wounds and their 5 up ward, they will stick around for a good long time and tie stuff up when you need them to. Next up, we have the main demon infantry, which is the Plague Bearers. They've got a decent 2 health, but they only have a 6 up save. They do get made better with the 5 up ward though, and at 140 points for 10, I mean, let's be honest, that's not an amazing profile. They are also very, very slow with a 4-inch move, which is their big issue, and only 1 attack that hits on 4s, wounds on 3s, and has no rend, so it is quite pathetic. They do have the crit mortal ability to help that out, and they are also -1 to be hit from shooting attacks thanks to Cloud of Flies, which definitely does help them sit on objectives. But these guys are definitely not a melee powerhouse, and even with the 5 up ward, they are not super durable. In essence, they are practically the same difficulty to take down as Nurglings, and whilst they can be buffed in a few ways like we saw earlier with some of the characters, I would say overall they are quite expensive for such a poor output unit. What they are good for is sitting on objectives, and they do that well enough with the 5 up ward, with 2 health, and with the -1 to be hit from shooting. They can be quite tricky to push off an objective unless your opponent does get into melee with them. As we move on to the mortal side of things, we start with what is arguably the god level hero character of the army, which is the Glotkin. He is still super pricey at 550 points, although he is slightly cheaper than he was in 3rd edition, but only by 30 points. He also has the very enviable stat line of 24 health, a 4 up save, a 5 up ward, 10 control, and also a somewhat respectable 6-inch move. He's lost his ranged attack, but he still has his tentacle, his maw, and his scythe, all of which have got, in my opinion, a little bit better. The tentacle is now always 4 attacks, hits and wounds on 2s with 2 rends, and is now D3 plus 3 damage instead of just 3, so a big improvement there. His maw is the exact same as before, 3 attacks, hitting on 3s, wounding on 2s with 2 rend and 3 damage, and then his scythe is also a little bit better. It's just a flat 2 damage now rather than D3, so it's much more reliable, and I always say that 2 damage is better than D3. He's got his spell, Overgrowth of Flesh, which is cast on a 6 and lets you choose an enemy within 12 inches of him, and you roll a number of dice equal to their health characteristic. On an each 5+ you do a mortal damage. It's only up to a maximum of 7, and also being a roll based on the health characteristic of the target unit, it's not great against 1 or 2 health infantry, but against something like Archaon or Nagash, you will have a very good chance of getting at least 5 or 6 or maybe even 7 mortal damage through, which is very good. One of his other abilities is a passive called Horrific Opponent, which very simply reduces enemy control scores by 3 when they're in combat with him, which really will help him to steal objectives on top of his flat control score of 10, which is really good. And then his Rampage is Blighted Stampede, which is done when you declare the countercharge command. This lets you pick 2 friendly Maggotkin units wholly within 12 inches of him, and if the Glotkin successfully charged, they can also each use the countercharge ability without using a command point. So you can potentially have 3 units in your army countercharging in the enemy turn, remember, for just 1 command point. And this is ridiculously good and can completely ruin your opponent's entire charge and subsequent combat phase if they had a load of buffs or abilities or procs that they were hoping to get off or get set up that you can shut down by getting the charge off into them. Next up is the first of the Maggotkin Lords, Morbidex Twiceborn. He's got 14 health, an 8-inch move, a 4-up save, and that standard 5-up ward. He is very much the Nurgling buffer of the 3 Maggotkin Lords. He has some token shooting with 3 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage, but then in melee he is better. He's got a decent 5 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and have 2 damage, and then his Mount Triple Tongue has a further 5 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 2s with 2 rend, and these have 3 damage, so actually a fairly scary melee output. His Lord of the Nurglings passive allows him to give 3 to the control score for friendly Nurglings within 12 inches, and also lets them ignore the first point of damage inflicted to them in each phase. So he's really good at making Nurglings a little bit tankier, but also much better at holding objectives for you. On top of that, he can also heal half of the damage points he's taken at the end of each turn, so he could possibly be getting back 6 or 7 health every single turn, which makes him incredibly resilient. And then of course, as a monster, he does have a rampage. Tide of Nurglings gives a unit of Nurglings within combat range the crit mortal ability on a 2+ in the combat phase, so he can also just make them a little bit killier in melee too. For 310 points, I think he's actually okay. He's certainly not the best of the Maggotkin Lords, I would say, but if you are bringing a lot of Nurglings and you want to buff them up, he can do that very, very well. Globe Rotspawned is the caster of the 3. He is a 1-cast wizard with the same 14 health, 8-inch move, 4+ save stat wheel. His shooting attack is a bit better. It hits on 2s and wounds on 4s, but does D3 damage instead of just 1. And then his melee is a little bit weaker. It's the same 5 attacks from his mount, but his scythe is only 3 attacks instead of the 5 from Morbidex. He's got the Miasma of Pestilence spell, and this is cast on a 6 and allows you to roll a dice whenever an enemy unit he chooses within 12 inch has damage points inflicted by a friendly ability, and on a 4+ you inflict another damage point. This seems quite good, I think. You can likely pop off an extra few mortal damage across things like other spells, or when you fight, or when you do diseased effects on an enemy unit, so it is just another way to spam more mortal damage, more chip damage onto your opponent. His rampage ability is Demon Flies. This is done in any combat phase and allows you to pick an enemy unit, or pick each enemy unit, within 7 inches, and you roll a dice for each of them, and on a 4+, they take 1 mortal damage, which is kind of neither here nor there, but they are also -1 to their hit rolls. So yes, it's again a tiny bit of extra mortal damage, but the nice thing here is potentially debuffing enemy units and making them much worse at hitting in combat. He's a little bit pricier at 320 points, but if you want a very fast moving, durable caster that can also do some great chip damage with some mortal wound spam and also do okay in melee, he does seem like a very good pick to me. Next up we have another named hero, Gut Rot Spume. He's got a reasonable 7 health and a 4-up save, and the as ever slow 4-inch move. For his 180 points, which isn't cheap, he has 5 anti-hero attacks that are 2 rend against heroes and have the crit mortal rule and do 2 damage each, so he can do some good work into lighter enemy heroes. He can also give an enemy hero strike last on a 3+ thanks to his flailing tentacles, which will really help him out and at least some of the time allow him to fight them before they can hit him back. And then finally, he has a very strong deployment rule with the Master of the Slime Fleet, letting him and his entire regiment be set up in reserve before Pestilential Beachhead allows them to come onto the board within 7 inches of a battlefield edge and 9 inches from enemies in your movement phase. So this is really strong for getting a few units up the board onto a flank and up into combat that much more quickly, and really will help you get around that very slow 4-inch move. The Lord of Afflictions is the fly-riding mortal hero. He's 220 points, so pricey, but he's very tanky with a 3-up save to back up his 8 health and 5-up ward. He's got the same 6 fly attacks, but his Fester Spike is actually quite scary. It's 4 attacks that hit and wound on 3s. It's only got 1 rend, but then it's 3 damage on the charge, so it will do a lot of work into your opponent. And with that 8-inch move, he can get into combat really quite reliably. In terms of his War Scroll abilities, he's got the Vectors of Foulest Contagion, and this lets you pick 3 enemy units that he is in combat with and roll a d3 and do that much mortal damage on a 2+ to them. So again, nice for plinking even more mortal damage into the enemy, whilst his Master of Rotflies rule gives him and up to 2 units of Puscoil Blightlords +1 rend to their Fly's companion attacks if he's made a charge. So he can pick 2 Puscoil units wholly within 12 inches to get the buff, and this does significantly boost the output of all of those fly attacks, and there is quite a lot of them if you manage to get 2 other units buffed up with it too. Orgut's Demon Spew is the last of the Maggotkin. He's got a slightly better 3-up save, and he is the fighter of the 3. His mount has the same profile, but his rot axes are much better in melee. They are 7 attacks with the same 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage profile. So he is very, very killy. He also has Acid for Blood. His Acid Ica rule means that if you roll a 6 for his saves, you reflect 1 mortal damage back onto the enemy. So that is a nice way to kill off again some weaker chaff that may be trying to tie him up or bother him. And then he also has the Grasping Tongue Rampage, and this lets you pick a unit and roll a dice, and on a 3+ you get +1 to wound them for all friendly Maggotkin units that fight them that turn. So he goes up to wounding on 2s, but also anything else in combat alongside him will get that very nice buff as well. Orgut's is 340 points, so he is the priciest of the 3, but if you want a pure melee powerhouse that can also buff the rest of your forces by giving them that +1 to wound on an enemy unit, he can do that really quite well for a reasonable price really, considering on top of that his fantastic durability. On the mortal side of foot heroes, the Lord of Blights is 170 points for 7 health and a 3-up save. His attacks are 3 damage, which is very nice. The hammer hits and wounds on 3s with 4 swings, and also gets +1 rend against charging units, so he can be quite scary against any enemy cavalry that may be charging into him. He's also got a really strong passive, Festering Bulwark, that gives Blight Kings wholly within 12 inches the anti-charge +1 rend ability too, so this makes him and a few units of Blight Kings a ridiculously good anvil. And then Thrice Ripened Death's Heads is in any combat phase. You pick an enemy unit that's charged and roll a d3, and on a 2+ do that much mortal damage. So you are just never going to want to charge this guy if you are up against the Maggotkin, and if you do and manage to charge some cavalry into him and his entourage, you will be taking a lot of pain back in return. The gorgeous new Harbinger of Decay is a 1-enchant priest, and I think the only priest in the army. Again, he's got that better 3-up save compared to the demons, and again, he has a tasty 3 damage weapon with his Scythe or Rot Sword, so you can potentially do up to 9 damage from that weapon alone. His chant is Omens of Decay, which goes off on a 4+ and lets you subtract twice the current battle round from a unit's control score that is within 12 inches. And if you chant it on a 10+, it affects all enemy units within 12 inches. So potentially, in Battle Round 4, dropping control by 8 for all enemy units within 12 inches, which is unbelievably good for helping you flip objectives and score points. It alone, I would say, makes his 200 point cost worth it. But on top of that, he can also pick 3 enemy units within 24 inches in the enemy hero phase once per battle and make them -1 to move, run, and charge rolls for the turn. So on top of that, he is a solid little debuffer, and if you are worried about an enemy unit moving onto an objective or moving up and then charging, you can make it potentially -2 or -3 if they've got run and charge to their overall distance they can go. So he is quite a nice little way of protecting you from any really fast moving enemy charges too. There's also a foot sorcerer for the mortals. The Rotbringer sorcerer is 120 points and is a 1-cast wizard. He's only got a 5-up save, being a wizard, and some piddly attacks with his staff that do d3 damage but are only 1 rend. And then the main use of him is his Tainted Sorceries ability, which is in your hero phase. You pick an enemy unit that has had a spell cast on it by this unit, and you can roll a dice, and on a 2+, you also reduce that unit's ward save by 1 for the turn. So you can cast a spell on an enemy and debuff them, but then potentially debuff them further for a follow-up charge and make them weaker and much easier to kill for your guys. So I would say he's a bit situational, but he is a very strong debuffer, and if you want another caster in your army anyway, he's a relatively cheap way to bring one in. The Lord of Plagues is another melee-focused foot hero. He's got 7 health, a 4-up save, and a 5-up ward. His Great Blade hits and wounds on 3s with 1 rend, but it's only 2 damage, so it's okay. Where he kind of focuses, though, is on charging rather than standing still and taking charges. He can give +1 to charge for friendly Blight Kings wholly within 12 inches. So as I said, whilst the Lord of Blights we saw a little bit earlier is more defensive, this guy is more of an offensive buff piece. He can also give Blight Kings +1 attack in the combat phase if they've charged and are wholly within 12 inches of him on a 2+. So yes, he is definitely the move up, get into enemy's face and charge them option rather than the Lord of Blight. So it depends whether you want to run a more offensive or a more defensive army of the Maggotkin, but they are both 170 points, so either of them are good at what they do. It just depends how you want your army to play. But now we move on to the main frontline units for the mortals. The Pusgoyle Blight Lords go really well with your Lord of Afflictions. They are pricey at 250 for 2, so they're 125 points each, but they are 8 health with a 4-up save and a 5-up ward alongside a decent 8-inch move. They are mediocre in terms of damage. They've got 4 attacks each that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage on the charge, so it's okay, but it's not exactly stellar for their cost. And then they've got the fly attacks as well. They do get +1 rend on their main attacks if they are fighting over an objective you don't control, so you can get potentially 2 rend on the Fly Rider's arsenal, which isn't awful. And I mean, they are what you need if you want some fast moving units in a mortal Maggotkin army, so they are very useful in terms of just being so fast and able to get into combat quickly or lock down enemies to avoid them charging you. They just aren't as killy for their cost as things like Blood Knights or Chaos Knights by comparison. The Putrid Blight Kings, they actually lost a health in the move from 3rd edition. They dropped to 3 each, but they did also drop in points to 200 for 5 rather than 230, so that's not too shabby. They are still overall very durable with their 3-up save and 5-up ward, and they can do a solid bit of weight of dice melee. They've got 4 attacks each that hit on 3s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage, so a unit of 5 can kill over 6 4-up save infantry quite reliably. They are also very, very good at holding onto objectives for you. Their bloated bulk rule gives them +3 to their control scores when they're on an objective, so just standing on circles and keeping them with your slimy hands and tentacles is a really good use for them. And then of course with their health and their ward save and their armor save, they are quite difficult for your opponent to push off. The Rotmire Creed is the old Warcry unit. They are now 130 points instead of 140. They only have 1 health each and a 6-up save, so they are probably the squishiest unit in the book. They can move 5 inches though, so they're a tiny bit faster, and they can do some cheeky disease tricks from a distance thanks to their Contagion Blowpipes and Virulent Concoctions rule. What this does, it allows you to use the Blessed by the Plague Father ability to infect an enemy unit that has been damaged by their blowpipes, even if that unit isn't in combat with any Maggotkin unit. So again, it's just another way to spread that disease debuff even further around. I would say overall, they're not great. They do look cool, which is nice, and it can help you get those diseases up and running maybe a turn quicker if you do have a mostly slow foot army on the board, so it can help you get those diseases and those mortal damage up and running that much quicker. But I would say overall, they're not the most competitive option. Finally, we get to the Feculent Gnarlmaul. This guy, or not this guy, this tree, should I say, has 7 health, a 5-up save and a 5-up ward. It does have some token attacks with its maggot-infested mouth, hits on 4s, wounds on 3s with 1 rend and d3 damage, so again, nothing amazing. The main ability of it is spreading the diseased keyword to an enemy unit within 6 inches of it at the end of any turn on a 4+. So it's not super exciting. It is, again, just another way to get those diseases up and running as soon as possible. Now, I think having one, obviously, in your army is useful to have an area where you can reliably get the diseases spreading, and having the ability to summon another one for free from Slimex is very good. But as I said near the beginning, the formation to have a second one just doesn't feel all that worth it to me, unless you really know there are areas on the board where you want to have that aura of disease spreading. I would say just rely on the one you can get. Even if you aren't bringing Slimex, I think one is going to be enough to lock down an area of the board that you need it to. Having 2 is nice to have, but not mandatory. Having potentially 3 from Slimex and the formation just feels like a bit of a waste to me. In general, I'm a fan of this army. They are slow moving, they are expensive, but they are very, very elite. They do feel tough. And I personally really like the new way of generating and spreading disease. I think they've got a load of mortal damage output. Yes, it's all quite low and seems to be very chippy, but by the end of the game, almost every unit in the enemy army is going to be bleeding 2 or 3, maybe even 4 mortal damage at the end of every turn, thanks to diseased and the other various rules that you can bring and put onto them. So they can really make it difficult for enemy armies to keep going by the end of the game, and that can make it much easier for you to then flip objectives, even with your lower model count, as their infantry just dies and dies and dies over the course of the game, so that you can play the long game, wait for the enemy to die off, and then just in the last couple of turns, just sweep the board, steal all the objectives, and win in sort of turns 3 or 4 or 5. But as always, what do you make of the Maggotkin of Nurgle? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.